Hello, I'm Kristina Wyckoff. I am the Section 106 Coordinator and Historical Archaeologist here at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. I would like to welcome all of you to our first OK SHPO Lunch and Learn presentation. Today, our own Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer, Linda Ozan, will present Beyond D&D, Creative Mitigation in the Section 106 process in Oklahoma. As Linda is speaking, please feel free to post your questions to the Q&A feature of the application on your right. Please note that questions will be reviewed by a moderator before they post to a wider audience. I anticipate we'll have time for all of the questions today, but if there are unanswered questions, OK SHPO staff will ensure that responses are sent to you at the email address you registered with. And with that, I'll pass the mic to Linda. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our first Lunch and Learn. Kristina will be talking to you later when I conclude my presentation about upcoming Lunch and Learns that will be available. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. So as she said, the topic today is Beyond D&D, Creative Mitigation in the Section 106 process in Oklahoma. If you follow our Facebook feed at all, someone posted this time and said, please tell me that Beyond D&D refers to Dungeons and Dragons campaign where the players are teams of historic preservation specialists. And I have to admit, I know absolutely nothing about Dungeons and Dragons, but I do know a lot about Document and Destroy. So today we're going to talk about some alternatives to the traditional methodology for mitigation. So a key benefit of creative mitigation is that it allows consideration of managing significant resources, i.e. historic properties in Section 106 terms, in a holistic rather than a project-driven fashion. When you weigh treatment options, we can reflect on what may be best for the resource in the context of all stakeholders, including tribal members, descendant communities, and the public interests and concerns. A more meaningful and thoughtful mitigation process should become an integral part of historic preservation cultures. Applying a standard approach, such as fully documenting a historic built environment, meaning Historic American Building Survey, Historic American Engineering Record, or Historic American Landscape Survey, or archaeological data recovery, i.e. Phase 3 data recovery, is often easier than considering alternative mitigation possibilities. Creative mitigation is a more engaged process built on collaborative process that considers the balance between diverse viewpoints and objectives about what is best for the resource or a group of resources. This process is likely to include consideration of mitigation measures that enhance public and technical knowledge, as well as protection of the historic resources. Creative mitigation should focus on the needs and desires of the stakeholders as they relate to the impacted historic properties. Data recovery, analysis, report writing, and curation may not be of interest to tribes as their views on archaeology may differ from archaeologists and agencies. Photography and measured drawings may not be the appropriate mitigation given a project's scope. So the first one we want to look at today is the Tahlequah wastewater treatment plant. So in consultation with the Cherokee Nation, the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, and the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office, it was determined that the construction of a third equalization basin at the plant would have an adverse effect on the Illinois campground adjacent to the project. The campground has both religious and cultural significance to the Cherokee. After numerous site visits and many meetings, it was determined that meaningful mitigation for the nation would constitute the development and implementation of a visual barrier plan. The plan included a description of the visual barrier, final design plans, installation timing, short and long-term care, and a maintenance plan. As requested by the nation's ethnobotanist, The barrier should consist of river cane, pecan, pin oak, and black walnut trees. As this is an ongoing project, we received quarterly reports per the stipulation of the MOA. Currently, they are having issues finding landscapers willing to install the vegetation. If a contractor is not found by September, all parties will re-enter into the consultation to address timing extensions and/or alternative plant choices. The one thing that we all deal with when it comes to Section 106 is the installation of cell towers or emergency towers in neighborhoods. So most recently, we looked at 2 new installations affecting historic resources in Oklahoma. So the first was a 265-foot tower near the Boiling Springs State Park. And once constructed, it was determined to have an adverse effect on the park. The park had been determined eligible for the National Register, and as such, we requested in the MOA that they update the existing preservation resource identification forms, photographs, and mapping to determine if that park is even still eligible for the National Register. In Okfuskee County, we had another installation of a 265-foot tower that, once constructed, would have an adverse effect on the Okemah Armory and the Okfuskee County Courthouse. Now, the Okfuskee County Courthouse was listed in 1984 as part of a larger thematic nomination for courthouses, which meant that in 1984, the documentation wasn't up to today's standards. So as such, we requested that both properties, the courthouse and the armory, have an updated National Register nomination, which included the new form, modern photographs, and mapping. It also included the most recent property owner contact information as well as representative information. We had a new tower request for an install of a 145-foot tower in the town of Chickasha that, once constructed, would have an adverse effect on the National Register listed New Hope Baptist Church. And that's the red dot on the map. As this was a fairly recent nomination, an updated nomination was not a viable option. So what we proposed was that since we had no information on the surrounding neighborhood, the telecommunications company hire a consultant to complete a historic survey of the historically African American neighborhood surrounding the New Hope Baptist Church. And then we also review things such as co-locations. So typically on a co-location, if it has minimal effect to a historic resource, or if we determine that it's a conditional no adverse effect, we don't have to move into a memorandum of agreement. But for those conditional no adverse effects, they do have to do something to offset the effect that it could potentially have to this historic resource. So here we're looking at 2 resources, one that's National Register listed, the First Christian Church on the lower photograph, and the Southwestern Medical Tower on the upper photograph. With the First Christian Church, about 12 to 13 years ago, Cox Communication had decided they wanted to enter into the telecom world and wanted to install cell towers and start their cell phone company. As it turns out, it proved to not be as lucrative for them, so they ended up not doing it. But in the meantime, the SHPO reviewed hundreds of cell tower installations for Cox Communication. And one of them was on the white tower in the background of the church. This tower serves really no other function than it actually has flames that come out the top of it that you could see from around town. But it is now used as a communications tower, essentially. And so when we agreed to let them install, or to the installation on this property, it was with the condition that their cell array had to be painted the same color as the tower. And since that didn't happen, we didn't have to worry about that one. But you can see from the photograph that someone has actually installed a cell tower since then, or a cell array on it since then. The photograph on the upper is, like I said, the Southwestern Medical Tower. And this one, again, was just a smaller cell array that they wanted to put on the building. And so with this one, the condition was that they put it on the elevator penthouse so that it couldn't be seen from ground level. And as you can see from the photograph, you can't see the elevator penthouse. So it was easy to do a no condition or no adverse effect on this particular cell tower installation. So in the past few years, we've also worked on the project with the USDA, and theirs was to replace a bridge at their grazing lands at Fort Reno that was constructed by the POWs held at Fort Reno. Because of its significance, the MOA stipulated both historic American engineering record documentations, drawings of the bridge, a historic context of the prisoners of war that were held at Fort Reno, that the POW embossed emblem be removed from the bridge and moved to the museum on site, and that archaeological monitoring of the Fort Reno Scout Camp adjacent to the bridge be completed during demolition and construction. As part of the documentation, I wanted to show you, one, what the embossed emblem looked like, and that it was in fact removed and is now housed in the museum. But also a letter that was part of this documentation that reads, "In the year 1944, may it be the year of the German victory. We built this fireplace for the German prisoners of war. May the world know that we, the prisoners, were treated well and did not have to work very hard. Fort Reno, January 3rd, 1944. So as part of the documentation process, the consultants actually had access to all the archives at Fort Reno and learned quite a bit about the POWs that were located there. But there are, in fact, other alternatives to document and destroy beyond what we've seen in Oklahoma. One is to start utilizing ArcGIS story maps. So here is the example in Tempe that they used as part of just a documentation process of their downtown. So it gives you many details about the historic resources located downtown and summaries about perhaps who the architects were, when the buildings were built, those types of details. Here's one for New London. Again, this one has more to do with redevelopment. So what New London looked like originally and how it's progressed through time. And on our own website, we have story maps as well, and the opportunity to post story maps that are part of the mitigation process. Our staff is actively preparing multiple story maps. And let me qualify that by actively. Some of us have the source material on our desks collecting dust, right? Because we have to find the time to prepare these story maps as well. But Matt Pierce on our staff is working on one for the radio station in Ponca City. Kristina Wyckoff is working on one for the Steamboat Heroine. Matt and Kristina collectively are working on one for Rosenwald Schools and the U.S. Naval Air Station in Norman. And I am working on the one for the POW Bridge at Fort Reno. The Department of Veteran Affairs, the National Cemetery Administration, plan an expansion of the Florence National Cemetery. Both the cemetery and the nearby Florence Stockade are listed in the National Register. The National Cemetery Association conducted an archaeological survey of the expansion area and found that significant deposits related to the stockade were in that location. Mitigation of the archaeological site included extensive data recovery, a brochure on the stockade and the archaeology that was completed, a Teaching with Historic Places lesson plan, and the reburial of human remains. The South Carolina Department of Transportation widened U.S. Highway 52 through a portion of Darlington County. The highway widening project encroached on some of the historic landscaping of Dugdale, a plantation listed in the National Register of Historic Places. As mitigation for the adverse effect to the landscape, the DOT funded a preservation plan for the property. This plan documents the existing conditions of the house and the landscape. It identifies maintenance plans, and it identifies treatment procedures for that landscape. To mitigate the adverse effect of the construction of the new Loop 335 on the nationally significant Amarillo helium plant, the Texas Department of Transportation agreed to extensive mitigation, including the development of a history webpage about the plant, the preparation of a draft National Register of Historic Places nomination, the installation of a new interpretive sign at the site, additional funds to monitor historic properties on which the Texas Historical Commission holds preservation easements or covenants, and substantial contributions to the Texas Preservation Trust Fund grant program for future preservation of historic properties in the region. Oral histories are definitely a component that we should be considering as part of mitigation. On our site, again, we have places to upload any oral histories that come in as part of the mitigation process. That way we can share the stories if it is appropriate to share them. Section 106 and the NEPA process are generally viewed as a compliance-oriented and project-driven process. They tend to be viewed as straightforward ways to ensure that the development project can go forward. In part, this is because there is a perception among CRM practitioners and agency regulators that this is the most efficient form of mitigation. Rarely are questions asked about alternative types and value-added approaches to complying with these regulations. Traditional approaches to mitigation may not allow the diverse stakeholders to share their viewpoints and to create solutions that are best for the resources and the community. Creative mitigation measures can lead to long-lasting outcomes. But lest we forget, some agencies are not fully staffed and cannot undertake creative mitigation for every project. The key is to identify which projects and stakeholders can most benefit from each mitigation type. Mitigation of the adverse effect is the end result, but an alternative route to get to that end should always be considered. With that, we're going to open it up to questions that I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Linda. So the first question was from Marlene, and I can actually answer this. She was having trouble seeing and hearing the presentation and asked if a video would be available. And yes, we will have the video available on our website, and anyone who's registered should receive an email with a link to that video when it's available. The second question comes from Tori, and on slide 11, which I can jump to for you really quickly, the tower here in the background,
Yes.
Tori was asking if the flames are still operable.
It's a good question, Tori. The last time I toured it, which was a few years ago, the gas pipelines are still in the tower. Operational, I don't know, but the pipelines are still there. I was going to offer, I know Paula Mills is on this recording as well, or this training. Paula, if you had anything to say or add about the Tahlequah project, that would be great. Sorry to put you on the spot.
We do. I hear a lot of questions, especially from folks working with tower companies, asking about ideas for mitigation. And so I really appreciate you talking through all of these ways that we've handled it in Oklahoma, and also discussing these other options that are also available.
This is Paula Mills with the Oklahoma Water Resources Board. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting us to this presentation today. For the mitigation at the Tahlequah wastewater treatment plant, we have run into a couple of roadblocks, as you pointed out. It has been a very interesting process for us. We did have issues getting a contractor, and we recently they widened their search of contractors, and they have found one out of Arkansas that has been able to provide the plants listed in our document plan with the historical significance to the Cherokee Nation. So we're in the process of actually get them under contract with the idea of starting implementation in October or so. So we're excited to continue moving forward with that project. And, you know, it's been a very fun thinking about creative ways to approach this, as you said, to meet the needs of all the parties included in this, instead of just documenting and moving on and saying, oh, well, whatever.
Yeah. I think it was useful in lots of ways with this particular project, in that we had many meetings on site to specifically look at what the construction of the basin would mean, where it was in relationship to the campground, and then looking at those native species and talking about with the tribes what are the most appropriate ways to deal with it. So I think this one is definitely a great example of how we deferred to someone with expertise and knowledge of that area that we don't have, right? And it's not our place to really say what should be done, but the tribe stepping up with the ethnobotanists and being able to address that.
And I think that has been very important, as you said, to this input, because one of the things that we've been running in with these contractors, because they don't understand this process and understand the importance, is that, they suggest we'll just put in these easy to get commercial plants. And it's like, no, we really, that defeats the purpose of the mitigation. So it's having the Cherokee Nation involved in this has been very beneficial.
Well, thank you for speaking and appreciating me putting you on the spot.
Thank you, Kristina.
Thank you. Our next question is from John Keck. On prior projects, what role did consulting Native American nations have in developing mitigation strategies with agencies or with SHPO?
Well, and John, I see you actually posted that I just answered your question, but I will go on to say that we did another project with the Cherokee Nation in Tahlequah specifically about a cell tower installation, and it ended up involving some balloon studies. And while our office didn't deem that there were any historic properties that were going to be affected by that tower installation, the nation definitely had a different opinion because of their buildings that were downtown. And so the tribe and the communications company are working together to figure out some mitigation for that project as well. So when it comes to properties that are of tribal significance, we defer to the tribes because they know their history better than we do, and they know what it means to them. And so, especially in the case with the Cherokee on both of these examples, the companies or the federal agencies have really been working with them, and we just stand out of the way, right? And let the process take place. And we serve as a signatory and we review what's going on, but it's not really our place to comment on them.
The next question is from Greg Maggard, who asks, the Amarillo helium plant mitigation included a donation to a mitigation bank, Texas Preservation Fund. Does Oklahoma have a similar mitigation bank?
We do not. We've always considered that a pay to play for 106, right? And it's very rare that we accept finances as mitigation. It's not something that we've considered in the past. So no, we don't have one of those banks right now.
So those are all the questions that we have so far. Please feel free to let us know if you have another question. And I'm going to switch the slide navigator back to show your contact information, Linda.
Okay. And I will note that for those who haven't heard, state agencies are getting their email addresses changed effective Monday next week. So there's my new email starting at the end of the month.
Well, there are not any additional questions at this time, but if anyone has other questions, you can certainly email those to Linda or to myself. We'd be happy to hear from you.
Kristina, do you want to tell them what's coming up in September?
Linda, before that, I'm sorry, could you just sort of discuss the mitigation process? Just mitigation as a process, if I can ask you on the fly. Sorry. The call came from inside the building.
Okay. So once we determine that there is an adverse effect to a historic resource, whether it is determined by the State Historic Preservation Office, whether it's determined by the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, whether it's determined by a consulting party or a tribal nation, we then work with the federal agency to develop those mitigation strategies. And that's where having that conversation becomes so important, right? Everything that we do is about the consultative process. So we need to sit down together as a group and talk about what is significant about that property and how we can address that. And so once we get to that point and everybody is in agreement on what that mitigation should be, then we draft up the legal document, have the appropriate people sign it, and the people who are responsible for watching over it then take over there. Now, how we get to that point of what we determine mitigation to be, again, depends on who all the consulting parties are and what those opinions are. You know, the federal agency doesn't have to act on creative mitigation. But as I pointed out, it shouldn't always be about the most expedient way to end the process, but rather to get the most meaningful result out of that process. And so that's what we're looking for. And when we talked about the two projects that we've done with the Cherokee Nation, really taking that active role and what those mitigations should be, those were long conversations where we would sit down together or some of those were during COVID, so we would sit down virtually and have these conversations about what would be appropriate mitigation for these resources. I don't know if that answers your question, Kristina, but that's my attempt.
Thank you. So we do have one more question that's come in since, which is from Eden Hemming, who asks, how was it decided that these projects were appropriate projects for creative Section 106 mitigations?
I think what allows for the creative aspect to the mitigation tends to be who's involved in the project. When it's kind of straightforward, like the cell tower installations are really about, what resources are it affecting, how large is the APE that it's affecting, and then we can go from there. But when it comes to things like the vegetation barrier that was necessary or doing balloon tests to determine the impact of a cell tower, those get more creative. And that's where that creativity to 106 comes into play, because, the tribes need to be able to tell us what is it that we're impacting and how can we minimize that impact to those resources. Paula, you absolutely can say whatever you want to about Tahlequah, that process.
This came out of the last question we had, which had me thinking, this was a first for our agency going through this process. And so something that was unique for us, and maybe it's commonplace elsewhere, but the idea that this mitigation for this project does not end when the construction of the project is completed, because as part of our mitigation requirements was we are going to have extended monitoring and care of this barrier to make sure that it is established. And this extended monitoring is going to take up to 5 years or more. And so in agreement and with help of the Cherokee Nation, if it fails along the way, we are going to have to go in and replace it or try new plants to make sure that we do have a lasting product so that we can protect this going forward. So I think that's also something else to consider in other future mitigation projects is, how you might have to look past the period of what you're just trying to build to make sure that it's going to endure.
Thank you, Paula. That's a very good point. You guys are accepted that responsibility without question, and that was great. When we started talking about that and the maintenance of it and the long-term effect of it, I mean, it was great to see that you guys just stepped up and said, yeah, we understand that it's got to be maintained and it's got to survive. So.
Okay, we may actually be out of questions now. But thank you so much, Linda, for your presentation, for agreeing to present on this topic. And thank you to everyone who's attended. Thank you also for your questions. Before you go, I do want to let you know that we will be sending out invitations for our next Lunch and Learn presentation shortly. Those will probably go out next week. And that presentation will be documenting Wichita gathering places and allotments. And it will take place September 12th at noon. And we hope to see you there. Thank you so much.